Now to Russia, where authorities are continuing to suppress criticism of the invasion of Ukraine. Some parents have reported that their children are facing pressure at school, where they are taught that the war is only a limited military operation. Our correspondent Yuri Reshetov spoke with one Russian family who don't know if they'll be able to stay.
For Varia Zholika, music is the best way to unwind, to forget school and trouble with the police. A few months ago, authorities labelled the 11-year-old as problematic. They suspect her family of being anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, ever since that day in October last year when police questioned Varia and her mother.
I was afraid. The police officer was sitting right across from me. She was tall and she stared at me through her glasses. I thought, what does she want from me? I had never seen her before.
Varia's alleged crime was that she had refused to attend a new course on patriotism at school. In the mandatory class, called Conversations About Important Things, students are told that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just an act of liberation. Even worse in the eyes of the authorities, Varia's cell phone profile photo was an image of an arms-toting Virgin Mary, displayed in the Ukrainian national colours. The school principal suspected subversive behaviour and alerted the police. Threats, interrogation and a dramatic raid on their apartment followed, as Varia's mother, Yelena, recalls. She says it was a nightmare that lasted weeks.
They really caused me and my daughter a lot of pain. The interrogation alone lasted 4 hours. We were confronted with strange questions about politics, fighting, and about my daughter Varia, and about what kind of a bad child she was.
Varia's story is not an isolated one. Shortly after the start of the war, Russia passed a law forbidding what they called the discrediting of the Russian armed forces. For example, anyone who called the war a war rather than a special military operation, as the authorities dictated, risked long sentences. Hundreds of Russians who openly protested against the war and criticised the Kremlin have been taken to court. Some have been imprisoned. In the Zholika's apartment, the authorities tried to find evidence that would prove that they had broken the law, says Varia's mother, Yelena. They found nothing. Even so, the Zholikas remain under police observation. Yelena says her carefree life is over. She no longer feels safe.
3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined anything like this happening in Russia. Today, I no longer identify with the Russian state. The state is causing us too much pain. My children and me. I don't think we can expect anything good in Russia in the next 20 or 30 years, when my children will become adults.
And that's why Varia's family doesn't want to stay in Russia much longer. It's just a matter of time before they move abroad, she says. Varia has ambitions to become a great musician, free of any worries about the police.
Let's get more from DW's Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Reshetov, who filed that report. He joins us from Riga, from where he's been operating since Russian authorities closed down DW's Moscow office. Welcome, Yuri. Let's start with these conversations about important things. Tell us more about this subject and why it's so important to Russian authorities.
All conversations about what is important or important things is a school subject that was introduced on September 1st last year. It's supposed to teach students to love their homeland. In theory, that is not a bad thing, Phil. But besides teaching kids about the famous composers and writers Russia has given to the world, the main point of the lessons is often to present the war against Ukraine as a war of liberation. A liberation of Ukraine from the Nazis who supposedly rule the country, a liberation protection from the evil of NATO, which is supposedly fighting Russia in Ukraine. In addition, a second subject is to be introduced in Russia in the next school year, the so-called basic military training. As someone who was born and grew up in the former Soviet Union, I can personally remember this subject. At that time, we had to train to walk in step, to learn the weapons, to learn how to handle them practically. All this is soon to be a compulsory subject in Russian schools again.
And Yuri, is there much in the way of visible opposition to this war in Russia?
Well, it's difficult to say how many people feel in Russia are against this war, because those who criticize Russia's actions in Ukraine are more and more afraid to do so publicly. They are intimidated by draconian laws which can carry long prison sentences, and they can be denounced by colleagues, neighbors, or even family members. Many compare the situation today with the 1930s, when the Stalin regime, when people denounced each other. But it's quite clear that there are still many people in Russia who go to war voluntarily. Why? Because of the money. Many Russians in the provinces are poor, many have loans. The money they are promised for signing up to serve seems a lot to them, and the fact is Russia has the benefit of having such a huge population and could mobilize far more people than Ukraine. The only question is how long the Russians will put up with it. The last drive of mobilized people in Russia back in September proved hugely unpopular.
And Yuri, in a few weeks, it'll be a year since this war started. Just outline for us what sort of impact this has had on Russian society.
Well, look, the war has made people in Russia more fearful and insecure, I would say. There were different periods or phases in public opinion of the war. First, total shock. Then, after the first military successes and the propaganda effect, a sense of patriotic euphoria hit some people. Then there was a sense with some Russians that their army wasn't so successful after all, and doubts began to rise. Finally, the mood changed when Putin announced the mobilization. A huge number of Russians left the country to avoid having to fight, and now there is indifference. People are trying to live as if the war had never happened, or people are convinced by state propaganda that the war going on in Ukraine is a sort of proxy war between Russia and the West, with the USA and NATO propping up Ukraine, and they believe that Russia must defend itself.
Thank you for that, Yuri. Moscow Bureau Chief Yuri Reshetto in Riga.